Hello, my name is Joel Schneider. I'm going to talk about a commentary that I wrote that was published in the Journal of Psychoeducational Assessment. The commentary is called, "What if we took our models seriously? Estimating latent scores in individuals." The commentary is about two target articles by the same set of authors, Weiss, Keith, Zhu, and Chen. The first article is about the WAIS-4, and the second article is about the WISC-4. The two articles are very similar in their structure and in their findings, so I'll focus on the WISC-4. The study used the standardization sample to investigate the structure of the WISC-4. Two models emerged as fitting the data fairly well. One is a 4-factor solution and another was a 5-factor solution. The 4-factor solution is very similar to that of the 4 composite scores. The 5-factor model is very similar to CHC theory. The reason that this was published is not so much that the findings were all that novel. Other researchers have found similar findings, but what's different was the thoroughness of the approach. In addition, a clinical sample was used to see if the same structure that was found in the standardization sample applied to the clinical sample. They found that the model derived from the standardization sample fit very well to the clinical sample. Here is the 5-factor model for the WISC-4. At the top of the hierarchy is G, or full-scale IQ. This is a bit confusing because this is not the observed score full-scale IQ, this is the general factor, so probably we should call it G. This factor here is what is intended to be measured by the Verbal Comprehension Index, but it is not the observed score itself, it's a latent score, so we could call it GC, or crystallized intelligence. The Perceptual Organization Factor captures what is measured by perceptual reasoning, or we could call it visual spatial ability. There's a fluid reasoning factor and a sub-factor for inductive reasoning. GSM is short-term memory, and GS is processing speed. Something to note is that the correlation between G here and GF here is 1.0, that is, they're perfectly correlated. What this means is that this factor here is redundant. If you know this, you also know this. This path diagram is traditional, but it does omit something that can be important. These ovals here represent disturbance terms. G has an effect on GC, but it doesn't determine it entirely. It's determined by G and something else, according to the model. That something else is called a disturbance term. This disturbance term is not GC itself. It is the part of GC that is distinct from G. This is the thing that makes GC worth measuring because it makes it different from G. If we didn't have this, there would be no point in measuring GC because all we'd have to do is measure G and we wouldn't need this. This is the thing that makes GC worth looking at. So in the case of GF, because this correlation is perfect, it means that there's no room for a disturbance term. This, if there is something there, has no effect on GF, so we can get rid of it. In fact, we can get rid of GF. We can actually merge these two ovals, and then we would have a line, instead of going from GF to arithmetic, it'll go straight from G to arithmetic. And instead of a pathway from G to GF to induction, we can just go straight from G to induction. Now we could call this G or we could call it GF. It doesn't really matter which. According to this model, they are synonymous. Now in the Weiss paper, GF and G were almost synonymous, but not quite. So it's quite possible that really there is a difference between G and GF, but it just didn't turn out that way in this particular model. But the title of my paper is Let's Take the Model Seriously, and this is what the model says, is that they're synonymous, therefore one of them is redundant. I'm going to rearrange this model and put some color in it. In this case, the color is intended to be meaningful. So G is directly indexed by arithmetic, but it's also to be found in every other subtest too. This color is the color of G, and here in the observed scores, you can see how much variance in the observed score is accounted for by G. So a little less than half of similarities is G variance. Well, what's the rest? Well, this red part here comes from the disturbance term for GC. This factor here, DGC, the disturbance term for GC, accounts for a certain percentage variance in similarities. In addition, there's a subtest-specific aspect of similarities that is reliable. So this gray part accounts for this much, and this error accounts for this much. The amount of error variance came from the overall reliability coefficients from the standardization sample. Some subtests have cross-loadings. For example, matrix reasoning consists of a good portion of G, some portion of inductive reasoning, or the disturbance term for inductive reasoning here, and a portion of visual spatial ability, and they have about equal influence. You can see that simple search has just a sliver of influence from visual spatial ability. Now these latent variables are also mixtures. So GC, crystallized intelligence, is mostly an effect of G, but some portion is not, and that would be right here, so this much. You can see that inductive reasoning is almost entirely G, but there is a sliver of influence from something else. In contrast, GS has some G in it, but it's mostly something else. That is, this factor here determines GS to a greater degree. It is my belief that clinicians, when they look at models like this, can get overwhelmed. Not because there's anything wrong with their brains, but because no human brain is designed to handle this kind of information. What we do is take crude guesses. We look at the model and say, I wonder what scores should look like then. And if I see a particular pattern of scores, what can I deduce from it? Frankly, this is beyond all of us. And I think that we need tools, computer tools, to help us understand what these models mean for individuals. And there is a way to estimate the latent scores from the observed scores. In these sorts of models, what we're showing is the latent score having an effect on the observed score. And that's what's happening theoretically if we take the model seriously. But in practice, all we have are observed scores. So what we'd like to do is figure out from the observed scores, what are the latent scores? Now you know, and I know, that no latent score can be observed. That's what makes it latent. You can't see it. But we can take a good guess as to what it might be and put a confidence interval around that guess. So I'm going to remove all these lines. I'm also going to remove these error terms because we don't really care that much about them. That is, we don't normally try to estimate how much error there is, and it's hard to do anyway. What we would like is to take these observed scores and take a guess as to what a person's latent GC score is. So what we need is some sort of equation, some sort of weighting scheme of how to weight these numbers properly to get a good estimate of GC. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, shouldn't only these red ones have arrows? Well, it turns out that these tests can be weighted properly so that we can get a better estimate of GC when we include all of the data rather than just some of the data. We're going to get a weighted composite score. Now that weighted composite score is not going to be a perfect index of this latent variable. There's going to be some error. So there's going to be an error for the GC score. Now, it's not the disturbance term, the portion that makes it distinct from G. It's error. That is, we can't figure out what this score is from these observed scores. Because it's an estimate, it's not really a latent variable anymore. It's an observed variable. It's a weighted composite. So we'll call it estimated GC. And there's some error in it, and these scores are used to estimate it. Now, when we do the math, what we'll probably find is that these subtests should be weighted highly, and that these subtests should have a low weight, if any weight at all. So I have thick arrows here and thin arrows here. Some of these arrows might even represent negative numbers. Ideally, this estimated GC should have a high correlation with the latent GC. Now, if we never see latent scores, how can we figure this out? Well, there's some mathematical wizardry that can happen so that you can know what the correlation is between your estimate and the actual latent score without actually seeing what the latent scores are. How this works, I talk about in my commentary, but that correlation between the estimated score and the latent score is essential for figuring out how big your confidence interval should be. Now, not only do we want to estimate GC, but we want to have some estimate of whether or not our estimated GC is significantly different from our estimate of G. The reason that we care about this is that it sometimes is different from this, and we want to know, when is it different? Well, when this score is very different from the population mean, then this score is going to be different from this score. So we need an estimate of this. We don't need an estimate of this because we care about it directly. We mainly only care about it because it informs us whether or not we should care about this. And the procedure that we're going to estimate it with is the same. We're going to come up with some weighted composite score, take all of our observed variables, weight them, and come up with an estimate. It is an estimate, so there's going to be some error. After we work the math, probably what we're going to find is that these scores are going to be weighted heavily and these scores are going to be weighted negatively. Now, why is that? Well, all of these subtests have G in them, but we want to estimate something that has no G in it at all. The way we're going to do that is weight these scores positively and these scores negatively, and it'll subtract out the influence of G. Not entirely, so we get a little sliver of G variance in there. But the amount of variance in our estimate that comes from the thing that we're trying to estimate is substantial. Now, because it's a weighted score of these observed scores, you're going to get a little bit of influence of all these other things. There's going to be some visual spatial, there's going to be some inductive reasoning, there's going to be some working memory, there's going to be some processing speed in there. In addition, all of these observed scores have specific variance, in gray here, and error variance. And we can estimate how much this estimate is influenced by the thing that we're trying to estimate here, and also specific variance and error, and all of the other factors too. All of the details of how this works is laid out in my article. I want to explain the title, What If We Took Our Model Seriously? This model is probably not true, but it's a reasonable approximation, perhaps the best we have. It's my contention that if we take the model seriously, we'll make better decisions than if we just sort of eyeball it and take a guess. So, I'm not saying that the model is true. What I am saying is that if we pretend that it is true, we're likely to make better decisions if this is the best model that we have. Well, you might be saying, well, I don't know that this one is right. It's probably wrong in some way. Maybe these numbers aren't quite right. Maybe there's some cross-loadings that are missing, or maybe there's some other ability that's not even in this model that's influencing things, and I wouldn't want to use this model because it might be wrong. Well, it turns out that yes, this model might be wrong. It's almost certainly wrong. But you're going to use some model either implicitly or explicitly, and that implicit model that you're probably going to use is probably not as good as this one. So if you say, well, I don't want to use this one because it might be wrong, well, you're going to use some other model that's probably more wrong, and you're probably not going to use that model very well. In my opinion, it's better to use a somewhat flawed but reasonably accurate model and use it with some modesty. And what I mean by modestly, I mean we'll calculate the results and then not get too excited about them being absolutely precise. We'll leave an open mind for other possibilities. But the point is that we can use this model as a reasonable first approximation of what's actually going on. If we think something else is going on that's not accounted for in this model, we'll use this model as our anchor point and then adjust things accordingly as needed. A pretty good but flawed model is often a good starting point. Here's a spreadsheet that's available for download. At the top we see the same picture of the same model that I showed you earlier. It also has a reference to the article from which this model is derived. Journals publish models like this all the time, and clinicians are expected to do something with those models. Most of the time we just look at the model and have an intuitive sense of what the model might mean at the individual level. What this spreadsheet is intended to do is to take this model and make its implications explicit for individuals. So if we think that there's an ability called GC and it's latent, how well can we estimate this latent score in individuals? Down here we see a bunch of numbers. We can change the numbers as needed, but pretend that these are the scores for a particular individual. Here's full scale IQ and the 4-factor index scores. Here we have a lot of garbly-gook, but I'll walk through it. Full scale IQ in this individual is 101. The estimate for G for this individual is 103. Now why are they different? One reason is that full scale IQ is determined by 10 subtests. The estimate for G is estimated from all of the data that you have. In fact, if I only had some of these scores, like let's say I only for some reason got through 6 scores, I could still get an estimate of G from these 6 scores using this model. So it'll always estimate G, no matter what combination of scores that you have, but it uses all of the data. So full scale IQ and estimated G will not always be the same. Full scale IQ has a very small confidence interval around it. But that confidence interval is not the confidence interval around G. That would be a misunderstanding. The confidence interval around full scale IQ is really about the true score of full scale IQ. Now what's the difference between true score and the construct score? Full scale IQ is intended to operationalize G, but the confidence interval around full scale IQ is not around the G construct, but around the true score. Now what's the true score? Here's full scale IQ. This graph shows you the relative mix of all of the different constructs. Full scale IQ, 83% of it is determined by G. That means 17% is determined by other things that are not G. And these include the portion that makes GC different from G, the portion that makes GV different from G, the portion that makes inductive reasoning different from G, the portion of GSM that is different from G, the portion of GS that is different from G. In addition, all of the specific variance from each subtest is there, and also all of the error from each subtest is also there. And you can see the proportion of each source of variance in this column. So 6% of the variance in full-scale IQ is determined by DGC, the disturbance term for GC. 1% is determined by DGV, 2% by D-induction, less than 1% for DGSM, and less than 1% for DGS. 4% is the sum total of all the specific variances, and 2% comes from all the different error components of all the subtests. Now, what is the true score for full-scale IQ? It's not G. It's all of these sources of variance lumped together except for error. So, this pink portion, that's part of the true score. The green, the blue, the orange, and even this gray stuff that's from specific, that's also part of the true score for full-scale IQ. The only portion that is not is the error score. So the confidence interval tells us what is the true score for full-scale IQ, but it doesn't tell us how well we are capturing G. Full-scale IQ, 83% of the variance is determined by G. We need to use this figure, the 83% of the variance, to determine the confidence interval with which we estimate G, not the true score. Well, why does this matter? Well, if we're thinking of full-scale IQ as G, it turns out that we're not nearly as accurate as we think if we're using the reliability-based confidence interval for full-scale IQ. If we want to estimate G, in addition, we'd like to use all of the information that we have and weight it appropriately. And this is what this estimated G score does. We go from 83% of the variance for full-scale IQ to 86% of the variance for our estimated G. So estimated G does a better job of estimating G than full-scale IQ does. Now, something interesting is that estimated G has a little bit more error in it than full-scale IQ does. But it doesn't matter because all these other things, these other non-G things, added up together, there's less of it than there is in full-scale IQ. So it's actually a better measure of G, but it has a little bit more error. But that's okay, because we're not using full-scale IQ to estimate these non-G components here. We're using it as an estimate of G. So we want the best estimate of G that we can, not necessarily the one with the least error. So the confidence interval around G is actually fairly wide. Our best guess is that G is 103. Our 95% confidence interval goes from 92 to 114. So the odds are very good that it's between 92 and 114. Now, I've put some thresholds here at increments of 10 index score points, and you can use it to estimate how likely is it that G is really below 60. Given that our estimate is 103, the probability that it's below 60 is so low that even rounded it's 0. What's the probability that's less than 70? Well, again, it's probably 0. What is the probability that's less than 80? Well, now it's a very low probability, 0.00003. Not very likely. What's the probability that it's less than 90? Well, you've got about a 1% chance of that. What's the probability that it's less than 100? Well, it's a pretty substantial risk at this point, so it's pretty likely that it's less than 100, but it's probably not. There's 69% chance that it's greater than 100, 31% chance that it's lower than 100. What if this person has much higher G than we're estimating? Like maybe it's above 110, it's above average. Well, there's an 11% chance of that. So it could be above average, but it's a little less likely. What's the probability that we're really far off, that it's really above 120? Well, you've got about a 1 in 1,000 chance of that. What if it's really 130? Well, it's so low that we're rounding it to 0. Here what we have is the latent variable G's correlation with our estimate. So we have G, the latent variable, the one that we can't see, and our weighted composite, our estimated G. What's the correlation? The correlation is 0.92. Our estimate has 85% valid variance. That is, estimated G, about 85% of it, or 86%, is G variance. Here's the standard error around our estimate of 103. And that standard error was used to estimate these thresholds here. And it was also used to estimate this confidence interval. Take a look at GC. Our estimate is that it's 109. Our 95% confidence interval is from 100 to 117. We can see that 109 is higher than 103. But is it significantly higher? Well, the way we determine that is that we go to the disturbance term for GC and see if its 95% confidence interval contains the population mean of 100. So, if this DGC if its confidence interval does not contain 100, then we can assume that GC is significantly different from G, and we can think about it as something apart from G. If it isn't, then we say, well, it could be anywhere, but it doesn't appear that it's significantly different from G. So GC itself, well, it's 109. The probability that it's greater than 100 is pretty high, 97%. There's a good chance that it's above 110. The probability that it's above 120, not very high. So it's looking like it's on the high end of average, and it could be higher than that. Is that significantly different from 103? Well, look at DGC. It's 111. Now this is tricky. These DGCs, they're not really abilities. They're things that make abilities distinct from G. So I would be reluctant to think of this as an ability itself. Maybe future research would show that it is an ability, but think of it as a way, a mechanism of telling whether or not this is different from that. This 95% confidence interval does contain 100. Therefore, we cannot say that GC is significantly different from G. We can estimate where it is. It's likely between 100 and 117. But the odds of this being significantly higher than that, well, they're not bad. It could be higher than that, but it's not something that I have a whole lot of confidence in. In order for me to say that this is higher than that, the confidence interval for DGC has to not contain 100. What's the probability that it is higher than 100? Well, there's an 88% chance of that. There's a 56% chance that it's higher than 110. So the odds are not bad that it's higher than 100. Maybe GC is higher than G, but I'm not extremely confident that this is the case. In contrast, look at GS. PSI, our observed index of processing speed, is 75. Using all of the data, we're estimating that it's 80. So given the choice between these two things, we'll go with the one that has more validity. Well, which one has more validity? Let's look. PSI, 41% of its variance is determined by something other than G, and 30% of it is G variance. Our estimated GS score has more G and more DGS. Therefore, in aggregate, it's just a better estimate of GS than PSI. It does that because it uses all of the data and it weights it properly. What is the correlation of GS, the estimated score, with GS, the latent score? That correlation is 0.87. For this person, our estimate of GS is 80. The 95% confidence interval around that, and you're looking at, it's a pretty big confidence interval, but that's what we get with latent scores. We're not concerned with true scores, we're concerned with the actual construct that we're interested in, not some blend of a whole bunch of stuff. That's what the true score. True scores are blends of stuff that is not necessarily what you're looking for. A construct-based confidence interval tells us what we're actually looking for. We're looking for processing speed, GS. Well, turns out that the confidence interval is a bit wider than what we're used to. And you might be thinking, well, why would I want a wider confidence interval than what I'm used to? Well, like it or not, this is the world that you live in. If you thought that that reliability-based confidence interval was actually the confidence interval for GS, you're mistaken. It was the confidence interval for the true score, and the true score contains a whole bunch of stuff that you don't care about. So you've got a more accurate estimate of something that you don't actually care about or need to know about. The construct-based confidence interval is a little wider, but it is in fact what you're looking for. So 66 to 94, it's a big confidence range. Most likely GS is 80, but it could be somewhere not 80. Well, 80 is not 60. The probability that it's actually less than 60 is quite low, 3 in 1,000. There's a 9% chance that it's less than 70. If the estimate is 80, then the probability that it's less than 80 is 50%. There's a 92% chance that it's less than 90. Subtract that from 100, there's a 8% chance that it's higher than 90. What's the probability that GS is above 100? Well, there's a 3 in 1,000 probability. There's a very low chance that it's above 110. Is this 80 significantly different from this 103 G? Now, if we're talking about reliability and true scores, then you should just look at these observed scores. Full scale IQ, is it different from PSI? But that's not the question here. Is G, the thing that we actually care about, and GS, another thing that we care about, are they significantly different? And that's determined by this disturbance term. If the confidence interval for GS contains 100, then we can't say that this is significantly different from that. But if the confidence interval for this doesn't contain 100, then we can say with confidence that this is different from that. Just eyeballing it sure does look like it's different, but let's look at DGS. Our DGS is 74. Again, we don't interpret this as an ability, it's just a means to an end. It tells us whether or not GS is significantly different from G. So the confidence interval around DGS is 57 to 91. That confidence interval does not contain 100. Therefore, this 80 here is significantly different from this G of 103. This person's GS is substantially or significantly lower. We can be confident that it is lower than G. Now what about these other scores? SVC, for example, the specific variance for vocabulary. This S for vocabulary is not vocabulary itself. It's the specific variance for vocabulary. It's the portion of the vocabulary subtest that is reliable, but is uncorrelated with G and uncorrelated with GC. Now, do we care about it? Some specific scores we do care about and some we don't. So for example, vocabulary, the thing that makes it different from GC is fairly well understood. It's lexical knowledge. Now, lexical knowledge in its totality is probably best measured by the observed score. It's been converted to index scores, but as a scaled score, it's 15. As an index score, it's 125. It's the 95th percentile. But the thing that makes it distinct helps us know if this vocabulary score is significantly different from the GC score and from G. If this confidence interval contains 0, then we can't be confident that vocabulary is significantly different or that the vocabulary score is different from GC. Here it's 105 to 150. That's a very wide interval, but it doesn't contain 100. Therefore, we can say, look, there seems to be a specific strength for vocabulary above and beyond what we've already accounted for in GC, which in turn includes G. So apart from G, apart from GC, vocabulary is high for this person. What's the probability that this specific ability in vocabulary is higher than average? Well, we can be pretty confident. There's 99.1% chance of that. Probability that it's well above average? There's 93% chance of that. Probability that it's pretty darn high is 74% chance. Not, super high, but there's a good chance that it's really high. What if it's quite high, above 130? Well, there's a good chance, 41%. What if it's really exceptional, like above 140? Well, it's not likely, but there's still a substantial probability that this 15, that's a bit of an underestimate. Maybe it's much higher than that. So the beauty of these confidence intervals is that they allow you to get around the frequently heard injunction never to interpret a subtest score all by itself. These confidence intervals give you the confidence to do this. The price that you pay is that these confidence intervals are very, very wide. That confidence interval is 45 points wide. That's a 3 standard deviation wide confidence interval. But in extreme cases, it all works out. You can actually say, look, whatever is different about vocabulary, different from G, different from GC, it's high for this person. Of course, we'd like to do some follow-up tests, give another vocabulary test from another battery, and see what happens. Here's a graph of all of the constructs. G, the specific portion of arithmetic, GC, the specific portion of GC, and so forth. Here's a graph showing the relative mixes of all of the sources of variance for the observed scores and the estimated scores. In addition, I don't want you to take this too seriously, but we have this little tool here, and it gives us a sense of what is the provenance of the observed scores. So for example, if I click vocabulary, we start at the mean of 10, and G, because it's pretty close to the mean, it doesn't alter the score very much. And then GC, it alters it a little bit, and then some combination of specific and error takes the score and moves it all the way up to 15. So how did we get a vocabulary score of 15? Well, G didn't influence it that much. DGC influenced it a little. The specific variance and error is likely to have pushed it all the way up to 15. Now, is this the way that it actually happened? No, of course not. These are just estimates. This is our best guess. The truth is that it could be quite different. If somehow we knew that our estimate of G was wrong and it was actually some other number, we'd have to update all these other numbers to account for that. Here's full-scale IQ. Here's PSI. So PSI, G takes it a little bit above the mean, and the portion of GS that's independent of G, DGS, takes it down considerably, and then the error and the specific scores take it down even further. So most likely this is how we got to a PSI of 75. G didn't do it. It was the portion of GS that is independent of G that did it. And some combination of error and specific variance got it all the way down to 75. Now, again, this isn't how it happened. This is a guess as to how it happened. Let's walk through the entire interpretation. This person has essentially an average score for G. It might not be exactly average, it might be a little lower, it might be a little higher, but it's most likely in the average range. This person's GC is probably not that different from G. That is, this score 109 is not significantly different from G. GV, we're guessing that it's 100. The confidence interval around DGV contains the mean. See how wide this is from 76 to 117? It takes a very large deviation for GV to be significantly different from G. So because GV is not significantly different from G, we just have to worry pretty much about G and not worry that much about GV. What about inductive reasoning? Well, it's 107. Is 107 significantly different from 103? We'll look at the disturbance term, and its confidence interval does not contain 100. Therefore, this 107 can't be said to be significantly different from 103. What about GSM? It's 100. Is 100 significantly different from 103? Well, it doesn't look like it, but if we look at the disturbance term, 70 to 120, that does contain 100. Therefore, this is not significantly different from that. The only broad ability that can be said to be significantly different from G in this profile is GS. The confidence interval for DGS does not contain 100. Therefore, GS is significantly lower than G. Well, how much lower? Well, we only have guesses. It's quite certain that GS is below 100. It's pretty certain that it's below 90. There's about a 50-50 chance that it's below 80. And there's a non-zero, but fairly small risk that it's lower than 70. So most likely, it's in that 75 to 85 range. Our 95% confidence interval is 66 to 94. It's probably more like 80 than it is like 66 or like 94, but it could be, anywhere in that range. Is there any more information? Well, if we look at these specific scores and just look for the ones that the confidence interval does not contain 100, we see vocabulary. It doesn't contain 100, this confidence interval. Therefore, whatever is distinct about vocabulary from GC and from G, this person has a little bit more of it. Comprehension? No. Information. 53 to 97, that does not contain 100. This information score of 8, or 90 index score, is significantly different from this GC of 109. We can see that the development of GC is a bit above average and a little bit better on the vocabulary front and a little bit worse on the general knowledge front. The tests of GV, their confidence intervals all contain 100, as is true of all of the rest of the subtests. There's another spreadsheet for the WACE 4. The target articles have a 5-factor model, but in that model, fluid reasoning is so correlated with G that it's essentially unnecessary. It would be very difficult to distinguish between G and GF at the level of the individual. It can be distilled with population data, but with an individual, it's not really worth our time. So I'm going with the 4-factor model, in which we have perceptual reasoning, which is a nice blend of inductive reasoning and visual spatial ability. So I am associated with the CHC model, and I believe that fluid reasoning is distinct from G, but the distinction is so hard to make that it might not matter for individuals. Yes, at the population level, it's a reasonable distinction to make, probably, but at the level of the individual with the WACE 4, it is not an easy distinction to make, and therefore I recommend using this 4-factor model if you're using just the WACE. The way that this spreadsheet works is exactly the same that we use for the WISC. And the color scheme is essentially the same as well. I hope that this video helps you to use the spreadsheets if you use them in your clinical practice, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might send my way. Thank you.